by Will Smith, which was Chris got slapped in the face. One of the craziest things I'd ever seen. In fact,
On March 27th, 2022, one moment at the Oscars changed everything for Will Smith. What started as a shocking incident on live television quickly became a controversy that refused to fade, drawing in some of the biggest voices in comedy. But what did Dave Chappelle and Eddie Murphy really say about that night? And how did Will Smith's own children end up being dragged into the fallout? Join us as we break down how top comedians responded and what their words revealed about Will Smith's image, reputation, and the truth behind that moment. The night that changed everything. It all began with the 94th Academy Awards. Chris Rock was presenting the award for Best Documentary Feature. He was doing what presenters do, making a few jokes to warm the room before reading the names. He turned his attention to Jada Pinkett Smith, who was sitting in the front row with her husband, and made a joke comparing her shaved head to the character from the 1997 film G.I. Jane, in which Demi Moore plays a soldier with a buzz cut. "Jada, I love you," Rock said. "G.I. Jane too. Can't wait to see it." The room laughed. Will Smith laughed too, briefly, before his face suddenly changed. What Chris may or may not have known at the time was that Jada Pinkett Smith had been public since 2018 about her battle with alopecia, an autoimmune condition that causes hair loss. In an Instagram video in December 2021, she showed her followers the bald patches on her head and said she was learning to deal with the condition. When Chris made the G.I. Jane joke, Jada rolled her eyes. Will watched his wife's face change, and then something switched in him. He stood up, walked to the stage, and struck Chris across the face. The entire room went quiet and confused, because nothing like this had ever happened before. Chris stood his ground, visibly shaken, while Will walked back to his seat and shouted, "Twice, keep my wife's name out of your mouth." Despite the shock, Chris kept going. He completed the presentation and announced the nominees. The audience, stunned and unsure whether what they had just seen was real or scripted, sat in a collective state of shock that lasted for the rest of the night. Later that same evening, Will Smith stood at the same microphone where the slap had happened and accepted the Oscar for Best Actor for his role in King Richard. He cried, talked about love, and apologized to the Academy and to his fellow nominees. However, he did not apologize to Chris Rock until the next day, through social media. The Academy banned Will from attending the Oscars or any Academy-related events for 10 years. Will had also resigned from the Academy 4 days before the ban was handed down. The world was divided almost instantly. There were people who felt that Will Smith had done something understandable, even admirable, in defending his wife from a joke about her medical condition. There were people who felt that what he had done was assault, plain and simple, and that watching the Academy allow him to stay in the room and then win an award and cry about his feelings was one of the most disturbing things they had ever seen broadcast on live television. And there were comedians, and for comedians, it was an attack on their profession. This was a man deciding that a joke he did not like was worth hitting someone over. And the comedy community, from the biggest names down, had things to say about that. Many people assumed one thing, that Jada Pinkett Smith had something to do with it. But when she finally spoke, her account told a very different story. Sitting in the audience that night, Jada's first reaction was exhaustion. When Chris Rock made the joke, she reportedly rolled her eyes, thinking it was just another repeat of old tension. At that point, it didn't feel like anything new, but what happened next completely caught her off guard. The slap was unexpected. In fact, Jada later made it clear that she had no involvement in what Will Smith chose to do. She didn't encourage it, she didn't signal for it, and she wasn't part of that decision in any way. For her, the moment unfolded just like it did for everyone else watching. Sudden, confusing, and impossible to process in real time. But there was an even deeper layer that made the situation more complicated. According to Jada, she and Will had already been living separate lives long before that night. While the world still saw them as a married couple, she revealed that they had not considered themselves husband and wife for years. That detail alone changed how she viewed the entire situation. Being publicly defended as a wife in a moment like that felt disconnected from the reality she had been living privately. It made the situation feel even more surreal. At the same time, Jada did not ignore the joke's underlying reason. Chris Rock's comment was deeply disappointing. It wasn't just about a joke, but about how sensitive issues are sometimes turned into punchlines without considering the people affected. She expressed that frustration clearly, pointing out that the comment didn't just impact her, but also others dealing with the same condition. Still, even with that context, she did not defend what happened next. One of the biggest misconceptions that spread after the Oscars was that Jada had somehow influenced Will's reaction. She pushed back against that idea strongly. From her perspective, she was unfairly blamed for a decision she didn't make. The narrative that she was responsible only added another layer of pressure to an already overwhelming situation. And that's where things became complicated, and the comedy world did not wait long to respond after the incident. Chris Rock himself broke his silence 3 nights later at a show in Boston, while the cameras were still on. But the 2 names that carry the most weight in American comedy, Dave Chappelle and Eddie Murphy, waited for the right moment and then said their piece in the biggest possible rooms. What did Dave Chappelle say first, and why did what he said go even deeper than a simple joke? Dave Chappelle's judgment. Dave Chappelle has known Will Smith for years. Both men have been major forces in Black American entertainment for decades. When Dave got on stage at his joint UK tour with Chris Rock in Liverpool in September 2022, 5 months after the slap, he was not getting up to simply make fun of Will Smith. He was getting up to say something he had clearly been thinking about for a while. Something that went past the joke and into the territory of actual observation. He opened his piece on Will by reminding the audience who Will Smith is before he was a movie star. Will Smith grew up in West Philadelphia. He grew up in a neighborhood where the rules of the street differ from those of the awards show. He grew up knowing how to handle himself in a way that his decades of careful image building had covered over, but not erased. A lot of people forget who Will Smith is, Dave said from the Liverpool stage. Then, 10 minutes before he was about to get the biggest award of his life, he acted like he was back in Philadelphia. That line got a huge reaction, not just because it was funny, because it was accurate in a way that felt like Dave had seen something that the audience had been trying to figure out for months. But the sharper observation came next. Dave said that Will Smith had spent 30 years performing a perfect version of himself for the public. Will did the impression of a perfect person for 30 years, Dave told the crowd, and he ripped his mask off and showed us he was as ugly as the rest of us. That phrase, the impression of a perfect person, is a very specific way of describing something that most people have felt but not been able to put into words. Will Smith's entire career had been built on being the likable one, the safe one, the one that crossed over and made everyone comfortable. From The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air to the summer blockbusters to the inspirational speeches and the marriage that he and Jada talked about openly and often, Will Smith had spent 3 decades being someone that you were not supposed to have complicated feelings about. And then in one moment, in front of the world, he stopped being that person. What Dave said next surprised people. He said he hoped Will would not put the mask back on. He said he hoped Will would let his real face breathe. And then he said something that was probably the most honest and least expected thing of the entire speech. I see myself in both men, not in one, not just in Chris Rock, the comedian who got hit, not just in Will Smith, the man who did the hitting. In both of them, he was saying he understood what it felt like to be pushed far enough to want to do something extreme, and he was saying he understood what it felt like to be the person in the room who everybody looks at after something goes wrong. Dave had his own experience of being attacked on stage. 5 weeks after the Oscars, he used that experience later in his 2023 Netflix special, The Dreamer, to revisit the slap, making the obvious comparison. He knew exactly what it felt like to be hit by a stranger while he was just trying to do his job. Chris Rock knew that feeling too. In The Dreamer, released on New Year's Eve 2023, Dave came back to the slap conversation with new material. He said that when he watched it live on television, he thought it was fake, that the unreality of it was so complete that his first instinct was that it had to be staged. He waited 30 or 40 minutes and then FaceTimed Chris to check on him. Chris answered. The first thing he said was that Dave was the only person he would have picked up for. Dave said that Obama and Oprah had both called, that everybody who was anybody in America had called Chris Rock that night to make sure he was okay. He told the story partly as comedy and partly as a real account of a real moment that had clearly stayed with him. And the conclusion he came to in The Dreamer was that Chris Rock had done something remarkable. He had refused to be a victim of it. He had turned the slap into material instead of turning it into a wound. That, Dave seemed to be saying, was the comedy answer to what Will Smith had tried to do. You take the hit and you use it. Dave said his piece across multiple stages over 2 years and called it as he saw it, an unmasking of someone who had been performing perfection for decades. But the single most perfectly landed joke about the whole incident, the one that got the biggest reaction, the one that people still quote, was delivered not at a comedy club, but at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, at the Golden Globes, by a man who had been in the industry longer than most people in the room had been alive. What did Eddie Murphy do, and why did it land the way it did? Eddie Murphy's 3 rules for survival. On January 10, 2023, Eddie Murphy received the Cecil B. DeMille Award at the Golden Globes. This is a lifetime achievement honor. The people in the room were the same kind of people who had been in the Oscars room 10 months earlier when the slap happened. The entire machinery of Hollywood. Eddie took the stage and did what Eddie has always done. He found the perfect joke for the perfect moment and delivered it in the perfect way. He started by talking about his 46 years in show business and his 41 years in the film business. He said he had a lot of people to thank. Then he said he was going to give some advice to the new people in the room, the up-and-comers, the ones just starting out. He said he had a blueprint, a definitive blueprint for how to achieve success, prosperity, longevity, and peace of mind. The crowd was listening. He had them exactly where he wanted them. It's very simple, Eddie said. Just do these 3 things. Pay your taxes, mind your business, and keep Will Smith's wife's name out of your mouth. The room erupted. The joke worked on multiple levels simultaneously. First, it was funny as a pure setup and punchline. The build-up of serious advice, the reversal into a specific celebrity reference, the callback to the exact words Will Smith had shouted at Chris Rock from his seat. Second, it was devastating as cultural commentary. Eddie had taken Will Smith's own words, the thing he had shouted as a declaration of protection for his wife, and turned them into a warning to young Hollywood. Be careful, because acting like that is how you become the punchline. Third, and this is the part that made it perfect, Eddie had done it in his acceptance speech for a Lifetime Achievement Award. He was being honored for his career, and he chose to use that moment of honor to deliver the most watched, most quoted, most shared piece of comedy about the slap that anyone produced. After the ceremony backstage, Eddie was asked about the joke. He clarified that he had nothing but love for Will and Jada, that it was all love, that he was not trying to wound anyone. But he also made it clear that he was not going to pretend the moment had not happened. That is the specific talent Eddie has always had. The ability to say the thing everyone is thinking in the way that makes it land as comedy rather than cruelty. The joke was mean in the way the truth sometimes is, which is to say, it was honest. Eddie had followed a blueprint his whole career. Stay out of other people's drama, pay your obligations, and do not let yourself become the headline for the wrong reasons. Will Smith had done the exact opposite of all 3 on the night of the Oscars. Eddie put that into a joke and delivered it at the most watched Hollywood event of the year. One of the most successful comedians in the history of the medium, at the highest point of a ceremony honoring his entire life's work, chose to spend 30 seconds of his acceptance speech on the slap. That tells you something about how big that moment was. Eddie and Dave are old friends and have known each other for decades. Dave has spoken about Eddie being one of his earliest inspirations as a comedian. When they were both on stage at the Saturday Night Live 45th anniversary special in 2019, the chemistry between them was obvious. They are men who understand comedy from the inside in a way that most people never will. When both of them independently chose to address the Will Smith moment, it said something clear. This was not just entertainment gossip. This was a moment that the comedy community took personally, because a comedian got hit, and when you hit a comedian, the comedy world responds. While Eddie delivered the perfect joke and Dave delivered the deeper analysis, neither was the person most directly affected by what happened. Chris Rock had to live inside that slap for an entire year before he finally said his full piece about it on the biggest possible stage. What did Chris actually say in his Netflix special, and why did what he said go further than anything Dave or Eddie had offered? 1 year of silence, then everything at once. Chris Rock broke his silence 3 nights after the slap. He was at a show in Boston. The audience was waiting for him to say something. He walked to the microphone and asked the crowd, "How was your weekend?" Then he said he was still kind of processing what had happened. That was all he gave them. For the next year, he toured relentlessly, building new material, performing with Dave and Kevin Hart on the road, dropping hints about what was coming but not fully delivering it. He refused to do a tell-all interview. He did not post about it on social media. He let the world wait. And then, on March 4th, 2023, almost exactly 1 year after the slap, he performed his Netflix special Selective Outrage live from the Hippodrome Theater in Baltimore, the first ever live global event on the platform. For the first hour of the special, Chris worked through other material. He talked about dating, politics, the Kardashians, woke culture, and addiction. He dropped small signals along the way. Early in the show, he said, "I'm going to try to do a show tonight without offending anybody. I'm going to try my best, because you never know who might get triggered." The audience laughed, knowing exactly what he was pointing at. He added, "People always say words hurt. Anybody who says words hurt has never been punched in the face." He let that sit. He kept building. He knew where he was going and how to get there. When he finally arrived at the Will Smith material, with less than 10 minutes left in the special, he came out swinging and did not stop. He called Will Suge Smith, a reference to the notorious Death Row Records executive Suge Knight, framing the slap as something from the world of street violence rather than Hollywood entertainment. "You all know what happened to me," Rock said. "Everybody knows. Everybody knows. I got smacked by Suge Smith." He said it still hurt. He said he had "Summertime" ringing in his ears, a reference to one of Will's most famous songs. He said he had spent the year watching Will's movie Emancipation just to watch the character get whooped. He said he had rooted for Will Smith his entire life. He said he saw him open up for Run DMC. He said Will made great movies. And then he turned all of that affection into the sharpest thing anyone had said about the whole situation. "And now I watch Emancipation just to see him get whooped." Chris explained the theory behind the special's title. He said Will practiced selective outrage. He meant that Will had gotten violently angry at a comedian for a joke about his wife's appearance, while Jada Pinkett and Will had been openly discussing her entanglement with musician August Alsina, a relationship she had publicly discussed on her own platform. Chris did not get into details about that, but his point was clear. The thing Will was supposed to be most angry about was not the joke Chris had made. The joke Chris made was a reference to a haircut. What Jada had discussed was considerably more significant to their marriage. Chris's argument was that Will had taken all his real, justified anger about his marriage and redirected it at a comedian who made a G.I. Jane comparison. In Chris's words, "His wife was hurting him way more than I ever could." That line landed differently from the jokes. That line was a verdict. At the very end of the special, Chris answered the question that everyone had been asking for a year. Why didn't he fight back? His answer was quiet, simple, and completely unexpected. "Because I got parents," he said. "Because I was raised." He paused. "And you know what my parents taught me? Don't fight in front of white people." The audience absolutely lost it. The line worked as comedy because it was absurd, specific, and perfectly timed. It also worked as something more than comedy, because it contained a real thought about dignity and restraint and what it means to hold yourself together when someone tries to humiliate you in public. Chris had been hit on the biggest stage in the world in front of hundreds of millions of people. His response had been to stay standing, finish the presentation, and keep working. His parents had given him the tools to do that, and a year later, he got to explain it in his own words on his own terms, in front of an audience that gave him a standing ovation. But the reaction to the slap was not only about comedians. The Oscars had 3 hosts that night, and one of them was Wanda Sykes, who had been backstage when the slap happened and had one of the most direct and honest reactions of anyone connected to the ceremony. What did the women who were there say about what happened to their show, Wanda Sykes, and what the Academy did wrong? The 2022 Oscars had 3 hosts: Regina Hall, Amy Schumer, and Wanda Sykes. The 3 of them had put enormous work into making sure that the ceremony felt alive and entertaining. Wanda was backstage doing a costume change when the slap happened. When she came back out, someone showed her the video. Her reaction was not comic. It was not diplomatic. She said she felt physically ill. She said she was still a little traumatized by it. When she appeared on the Ellen DeGeneres show a few days later, She described what the moment had felt like from her position. She had co-hosted the show, she had welcomed Chris Rock onto the stage, she had been responsible in some sense for the safety and flow of the evening. And then all of that had been shattered by something she did not see coming and could not have prevented. The thing that made Wanda most angry was not the slap itself. It was what came after. The Academy had allowed Will Smith to stay in the building, stay in his seat, and then go on to collect his Oscar. In Sykes' view, that was the wrong call. A simple and obvious wrong call. "I was like, how gross is this?" she said. "This is just the wrong message. If you assault somebody, you get escorted out of the building, and that's it. But for them to let him continue, I thought it was gross." She wanted to run back out onto the stage after Will won and tell the audience. Unfortunately, Will couldn't be there tonight. She also noted something that got less attention than it deserved. Nobody from the Academy apologized to the three hosts. That was a failure of basic decency that the Academy seemed not to fully register until much later. The only person who apologized to Wanda that night was Chris Rock himself. She ran into him at the after-party, and he came up to her and said he was sorry. She asked him why he was apologizing since he was the one who had gotten hit. He told her it was supposed to be her night. "You and Amy and Regina were doing such a great job, and I'm so sorry it's going to be about this now." That is the kind of person Chris Rock showed himself to be in the worst moment of the night. The person who got punched walked up to the hosts and apologized to them for disrupting their evening. Whether Chris knew about Jada's alopecia, whether the joke was in poor taste, whether Will Smith had reasons to be upset that we cannot fully understand from the outside, all of that is complicated. What Chris Rock did in the aftermath, the composure he showed on stage, and the grace he showed at the after-party are not complicated at all. Since the slap incident, has Will Smith come out to explain his side of the story? Will Smith's side. Will Smith has addressed the slap multiple times since it happened. In his acceptance speech that same night, he cried and talked about love and protecting the people you care about, but he did not mention Chris Rock directly. The apology to Chris came the next day, on Instagram, where Will wrote that he had been out of line and that he was wrong. He wrote that jokes at his expense were part of the job, but that a joke about Jada's medical condition was too much for him to bear, and that he had reacted emotionally. That apology was accepted, at least publicly, though Chris said for a long time that he was not yet ready to fully process the situation. In July 2022, Will posted a video on social media in which he tried to speak more directly. He said, "There is no part of him that thinks what he did was the right way to behave in that moment." He said, "There is no part of him that thinks it was the optimal way to handle feeling disrespected." He said that the answer is never violence. In November 2022, he appeared on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah to discuss the slap as part of a broader conversation about his career and his new film, Emancipation. He called it a horrific night. He said he had lost it. He said he was going through something that night, and acknowledged that nothing he had been going through justified what he did to Chris Rock. What Will Smith has never fully explained is what it was like to be sitting in that room watching the industry honor him for a performance in which he played a father who gave everything to protect and elevate his daughters, and then to feel, in that same room, on that same night, that his own wife was being mocked in front of everyone. His memoir, published before the slap, describes how he spent 30 years building a public persona amid what he calls a real lack of self-esteem and genuine self-respect. Dave had actually read that memoir, or at least the reporting on it, when he made his comment about the impression of a perfect person. Will himself had written about the gap between the person he presented to the world and the person he actually was. The slap closed that gap in the worst possible way at the worst possible time. The mask came off. What was underneath was not pretty, but it was real. The aftermath for Will's career was significant. His projects were paused. Companies waited to see which way the wind was blowing. His film, Emancipation, which had been expected to be a major awards contender, lost much of its momentum. The 10-year ban from Academy events was formally announced weeks after the ceremony. He eventually released a new music album and made public appearances, and the world kept moving, as it does. But the image that Will Smith had spent 3 decades building was not fully repaired by any of the apologies or explanations that followed. Once you have seen the real face, "It is very hard to accept the performance again." Dave Chappelle said that himself. He said he hoped Will would not put the mask back on. However, Will wasn't the only one who suffered from the intense scrutiny his single action caused. How did Jaden and Willow get dragged into the entire situation? The fallout that reached his family. When the Oscars incident shook Hollywood, most people focused on the moment itself. But what happened after didn't involve just Will Smith. It slowly pulled his entire family into the spotlight. Willow Smith took a calm and reflective stance. She didn't outright defend her father's actions, but she didn't condemn them either. Instead, she spoke about the pressure of living in the public eye, explaining that people in their position are often denied the freedom to simply be human. Her response felt careful, almost guarded, as if she understood the weight of every word she chose to say. She acknowledged the backlash but made it clear that she wasn't letting it affect her deeply. Jaden Smith, on the other hand, reacted very differently. Shortly after the incident, he posted an online message strongly supporting his father. It was brief, but it spoke volumes. While some fans saw it as loyalty, others, especially within the comedy world, did not take it lightly. His comment quickly became part of the larger conversation, raising questions about how far the situation would spread, and it didn't take long for comedians to respond. Meanwhile, attention kept circling back to Jaden. Having grown up in the spotlight, he was no stranger to public scrutiny. From his early success in films like The Karate Kid to his bold fashion choices and outspoken personality, he had always stood out. Over the years, he challenged traditional norms and expressed himself in ways that sparked both praise and criticism. Because of that, he became an easy target for discussion. In comedy, nothing is off limits for long, and his public image gave comedians plenty to work with. The internet, which never forgets, only amplified those conversations. Other comedians also weighed in. Bill Burr openly criticized Will Smith's actions and questioned the reaction of the audience that night. He pointed out the strange contrast between the incident and the applause that followed. Cat Williams, known for his controversial takes, spoke more broadly about the industry, touching on themes of image, control, and what it takes to succeed in Hollywood. All of this created a ripple effect that went far beyond a single moment on stage. What started as a single shocking incident became a long-running debate over comedy, accountability, and public image. Do you think Will Smith's reputation can fully recover from the slap? And who do you think handled this whole situation with the most class? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.